China didn't need tanks to outcompete the West in the 21st century. It didn't need aircraft carriers, missiles, or armies marching across borders. It just needed factories. Before algorithms, before AI, before semiconductors became dinner table conversation, there was something far more powerful and far less visible: supply chains. This is how China turned logistics, manufacturing, and patience into one of the most effective tools of power in modern history. There's something most people misunderstand about supply chains. They think they're boring, background noise. Warehouses, ships, spreadsheets. But supply chains aren't infrastructure. They're control systems. Whoever controls production controls timing. Whoever controls timing controls prices. And whoever controls prices controls politics. For decades, China didn't try to beat the West at innovation headlines. It didn't try to win prestige battles or dominate global culture. Instead, it focused on something much more fundamental: making itself unavoidable. By the late 20th century, Western economies had made a quiet decision: efficiency over resilience, cost over redundancy, shareholder returns over national capacity. Manufacturing was messy, labor-intensive, politically inconvenient. China offered a solution: cheap labor, massive scale, willingness to build anything, anywhere, at any volume. What looked like a business decision slowly became a structural dependency. This wasn't an accident. It was strategy. China didn't just attract factories. It absorbed entire production ecosystems. Raw materials flowed in. Components clustered together. Suppliers, subcontractors, tool makers, logistics firms, and ports all grew side by side. Instead of scattering production across countries, China compressed it into dense industrial zones. If one factory failed, another was next door. If a supplier collapsed, 3 more could replace it within weeks. This density created something the West no longer had: speed. A Western company could design a product. China could redesign the factory, making it in days. Tooling that took months elsewhere took weeks. Iteration cycles collapsed. Production problems were solved in person, on site, overnight. The result wasn't just cheaper goods. It was faster learning, faster scaling, faster dominance. By the early 2000s, China wasn't just the world's factory. It was the world's supply chain brain. Here's the key point: supply chains don't scale linearly. They scale exponentially. Once enough production concentrates in one place, the advantages compound. Skilled workers train new workers. Suppliers specialize. Costs drop. Quality rises. New entrants can't compete, not because they lack money, but because they lack proximity. At that stage, competition becomes theoretical. Western companies still own brands. They still own patents. But the physical reality of making things lives somewhere else. Design might happen in California or Germany, but execution happened in Shenzhen, Suzhou, or Dongguan. Over time, even design followed. And with execution came leverage. When China produces a single product, it's a supplier. When it produces an entire category, it becomes infrastructure. And infrastructure isn't replaced easily. It's not swapped out in a quarter or even a year. It takes decades. By the time Western policymakers noticed the risk, the dependency was already baked in. Medical supplies, electronics, industrial components, consumer goods, pharmaceuticals, energy equipment. At every layer, China wasn't dominant in one item. It was dominant in the inputs behind them. That distinction matters. You can tariff a finished product. You can sanction a brand. You can blacklist a company. But when the inputs themselves come from one place, your options collapse. Raise tariffs and prices rise at home. Cut imports and production stops. Move factories and you discover the suppliers didn't move with them. This is what weaponization actually looks like. Not a sudden cutoff, not dramatic threats, but quiet asymmetry. One side can absorb disruption. The other cannot. China understood this earlier than most. Western economies optimized for quarterly profits. China optimized for position. It was willing to run thin margins, even losses, for years. It was willing to subsidize capacity long after markets said it was inefficient, not because it misunderstood capitalism, but because it understood power. A supply chain that doesn't make money immediately can still make a country indispensable. By the time tensions rose, the system was already locked in. Companies couldn't leave without destroying themselves. Governments couldn't force exits without triggering inflation, shortages, or political backlash. Consumers expected cheap goods. Investors expected stable margins. Politicians expected calm. China didn't need to threaten. The structure did the work for it. And then something revealing happened. During moments of global stress, cracks appeared. Factories slowed, ports backed up, shipping costs spiked. Suddenly, governments realized how much of their daily life depended on distant nodes they didn't control. It wasn't just electronics or toys. It was gloves, masks, basic chemicals. Ordinary things that stopped being ordinary the moment they disappeared. This wasn't a failure of globalization. It was globalization working exactly as designed. Hyper-efficient, hyper-fragile. Optimized for cost, not continuity. China didn't break the system. It mastered it. And mastery creates options. Because when you sit at the center of global supply chains, you don't have to act aggressively. You just have to wait. Every disruption hits others harder than it hits you. Every attempt to decouple costs your counterpart more than it costs you. Time itself becomes leverage. This is the part most people miss. Weaponization doesn't require intent in every moment. It requires structure. Once the structure exists, pressure emerges naturally. Supply chains became China's quiet advantage, invisible, boring, and devastatingly effective. But no monopoly lasts forever. And the same forces that created this dominance carry the seeds of its limits. That's where the story turns next. To understand how deep this leverage runs, you have to stop thinking in finished products and start thinking in components. A smartphone isn't a phone. It's thousands of parts sourced across dozens of industries. Circuit boards, batteries, displays, rare metals, precision screws, specialized glass, packaging, testing equipment. Each layer depends on another layer beneath it. China didn't aim to dominate the top of that pyramid. It moved down into the foundations. Take electronics. Western brands still design many of the devices the world uses. But the factories that make the chips housings, the connectors, the boards that hold everything together, and the machines that assemble them are overwhelmingly clustered in China. Even when companies try to move production to another country, they often discover the parts still arrive from Chinese suppliers. The factory moved. The dependency didn't. This pattern repeats across industries. Solar panels rely on Chinese processed materials. Electric vehicle batteries depend on Chinese refining capacity. Pharmaceuticals rely on Chinese chemical precursors. Machinery depends on Chinese subcomponents. Clothing relies on Chinese textiles and zippers and dyes. It's not one choke point. It's hundreds. And that's what makes the system so resilient for China and so fragile for everyone else. If one factory shuts down, production reroutes. If one port slows, another picks up volume. The network is dense, flexible, and internal. But when the flow stops externally, there are no easy substitutes. Western economies once had similar ecosystems. Steel towns supported machine shops. Machine shops supported tool makers. Tool makers trained engineers. Engineers started new firms. Over decades, that web hollowed out, not through catastrophe, through optimization. Outsourcing didn't just move jobs. It dismantled industrial memory. When factories closed, the skills disappeared. When suppliers collapsed, the knowledge vanished with them. When production left, experimentation followed. Over time, entire industries lost the ability to rebuild quickly even if the money was available. China moved in the opposite direction. It treated manufacturing as a strategic asset. Local governments competed to attract factories. Infrastructure was built before demand existed. Power plants, highways, ports, housing, and training centers appeared around industrial clusters. The goal wasn't short-term profit. It was long-term centrality. Once centrality is achieved, markets do the rest. Companies gravitate towards speed, reliability, and scale. Investors chase efficiency. Consumers chase lower prices. Every rational decision pushes more production toward the same hub. The system reinforces itself. This is why supply chain dominance is so hard to unwind. It isn't controlled by a single policy. It's embedded in millions of decisions across decades. When Western leaders began talking about bringing manufacturing home, they ran into a problem. You can build a factory in 2 years. You can't rebuild an ecosystem in 2 years. You need suppliers. Skilled labor, logistics, tooling, testing facilities, regulatory expertise, financing networks. All of that takes time. China already has it. And because it has it, it can shape markets quietly. By increasing capacity, it can push prices down and squeeze competitors. By absorbing losses, it can outlast rivals. By moving faster, it can capture demand spikes. By controlling inputs, it can set the tempo of entire industries. This is how dominance looks in practice, not dramatic announcements. Subtle pressure. When production surges in China, global prices fall. Competitors elsewhere struggle to stay profitable. Factories close. Investment dries up. The supply chain becomes even more concentrated. Each cycle strengthens the center and weakens the edges. This happened in steel, in solar manufacturing, in electronics, in consumer goods, over and over. The result is a world where efficiency has replaced diversity, and diversity is what creates resilience. In a diversified system, disruptions are absorbed. In a concentrated system, disruptions cascade. When everything flows through a few nodes, those nodes become points of power. China didn't invent this dynamic, but it recognized it earlier than most. While Western firms chase lean inventories and just-in-time delivery, China built just-in-case capacity. Warehouses full of components, redundant suppliers, excess production ability. What looked wasteful in spreadsheets became invaluable in crisis. When shocks hit, China could restart faster, scale faster, supply faster. Speed became another form of leverage. Governments and corporations learned that when they needed something urgently, China was the only place that could deliver at volume. Emergencies reinforced dependency. Dependency deepened centrality. Centrality strengthened power. Over time, this created a quiet hierarchy in global trade. Not formal, not announced, but very real. Countries that controlled raw materials fed into Chinese processing. Chinese factories turned those materials into components. Those components flowed into global assembly. Finished goods flowed outward to the world. China sat in the middle. And the middle is where value accumulates. It's also where pressure can be applied without confrontation. When you're the center of the network, you don't need to break connections. You can simply redirect flows. Prioritize domestic demand. Slow exports slightly. Tighten standards. Adjust logistics. Each move looks technical. None look hostile. But the effects ripple outward. Shortages appear elsewhere. Prices rise. Production delays spread. Political pressure builds in importing countries. The structure does the talking. This is why supply chains are such powerful tools. They operate beneath the level of diplomacy. They influence daily life directly. And they're incredibly difficult to counter without massive economic pain. But like every system built on concentration, it carries hidden risks. Because the same bottlenecks that create power also create vulnerability. And that vulnerability is now reshaping the global economy in ways few expected. As China's position at the center of global production strengthened, something else began to shift quietly in the background. Control over supply chains started turning into influence over standards, timelines, and expectations. When you manufacture the majority of the world's components, you don't just respond to demand. You shape it. Factories decide which materials are easiest to source. Engineers design products around available parts. Logistics firms optimize routes around major hubs. Over time, entire industries begin building themselves around the capabilities of the dominant producer. What can be made cheaply becomes what gets made at all. This is how technical decisions turn into structural power. If a Chinese supplier standardizes a connector, that connector becomes the global norm. If a production line is optimized for a specific battery size, that size becomes widespread. If factories specialize in certain alloys or plastics, those materials become industry defaults. Innovation begins to orbit the supply chain rather than the other way around. Western companies often believed they were outsourcing production while keeping control of design. In reality, design slowly adapted to what Chinese manufacturing ecosystems did best. Products evolved to fit the factories. Over time, the factories shaped the products. This feedback loop made alternatives harder to build. Any company attempting to manufacture elsewhere faced higher costs, slower iteration, unfamiliar suppliers, and limited scale. Even when governments offered subsidies, the efficiency gap remained. It wasn't just about labor. It was about density of expertise. China had millions of workers who specialized in narrow tasks, tool makers who understood exact tolerances, engineers who had seen thousands of production runs, logistics managers who could move parts across regions overnight. This knowledge lived in people, not blueprints. Once knowledge concentrates, it compounds. That's why efforts to recreate supply chains from scratch struggled. Money could build factories. It couldn't instantly recreate decades of accumulated skill. At the same time, China continued moving up the value ladder. It didn't remain just an assembler. It invested heavily in upstream industries, raw material processing, advanced components, machinery manufacturing, industrial robotics. Over time, more of the supply chain became internal. The more internal it became, the less vulnerable it was to external pressure. Where once China imported many inputs and exported finished goods, it increasingly produced both. This shortened supply loops, reduced costs, and strengthened control. When disruptions hit global trade, China could rely more on domestic networks. Other countries could not. This shift changed bargaining power. When trade tensions emerged, Western economies discovered that pressure flowed unevenly. Tariffs on Chinese goods raised prices for Western consumers almost immediately. Restrictions on Chinese imports delayed production lines abroad. Attempts to isolate Chinese firms often backfired by hurting dependent industries first. China felt some impact, but the structural damage landed elsewhere. Because when you sit at the center of a network, every connection matters more to others than to you. This asymmetry became increasingly visible. Companies that tried to exit Chinese manufacturing found their costs skyrocketing, timelines stretched. Quality issues appeared. Some returned quietly after realizing the alternatives couldn't match performance. Public narratives spoke of diversification. Private decisions often reinforced concentration. The system pulled itself back together. And as it did, China gained something even more powerful than cheap production: predictability. Global firms could rely on Chinese suppliers to deliver at scale, on time, with consistent quality. That reliability became priceless in volatile markets. It made China the default choice even when political risk was acknowledged. Risk that is predictable is easier to manage than risk that is uncertain. For many businesses, dependence felt safer than disruption. This is how economic logic reinforced strategic leverage without anyone needing to coordinate it. But there was another layer to the story. China didn't just host supply chains. It learned from them. Every product manufactured transferred knowledge. Every production run revealed design flaws. Every failure taught improvements. Over time, Chinese firms absorbed techniques that once belonged to foreign companies. Process knowledge accumulated rapidly. Eventually, Chinese manufacturers didn't just build for others. They built for themselves. Domestic brands emerged. They moved faster. They understood production costs intimately. They could undercut competitors while matching quality. They iterated at speeds Western firms struggled to match. What began as outsourced manufacturing turned into competitive replacement. In industry after industry, Chinese firms went from subcontractors to rivals. Electronics, appliances, machinery, vehicles, energy equipment. The supply chain advantage became an innovation advantage. And once that happens, dependence deepens even further. Foreign firms relied on Chinese suppliers. Chinese firms relied on their own ecosystems. Global markets increasingly relied on Chinese brands. The center of gravity shifted. This wasn't a sudden takeover. It was a slow realignment driven by structural efficiency. Most policymakers didn't notice because nothing dramatic happened. Prices stayed low. Shelves stayed full. Profits stayed healthy. But beneath the surface, economic power was concentrating. And concentration always changes the balance. Yet no system built on extreme efficiency remains stable forever. The tighter the network becomes, the more sensitive it grows to shocks. The more centralized production becomes, the more pressure accumulates at key nodes. The same forces that made China indispensable were quietly making the global economy more fragile. And once fragility becomes visible, the logic that built the system begins to reverse. That reversal has already begun. And it's unfolding faster than most people realize. Once the fragility of hyper-concentrated supply chains became impossible to ignore, the world's economic logic began to shift. What had once looked like efficiency started to look like exposure. Factories that shut down for weeks halted entire industries. Ports that slowed created shortages thousands of miles away. A missing component worth a few dollars could stop products worth millions. Governments discovered that strategic autonomy wasn't about owning brands or patents. It was about controlling the physical reality of production. The same structure that had given China leverage now revealed why such leverage was dangerous for everyone else. Suddenly, resilience mattered more than speed. Countries began talking about reshoring, nearshoring, and diversification. New factories were announced. Subsidies were rolled out. Strategic stockpiles were rebuilt. The language of national security entered conversations once reserved for logistics managers. But rebuilding supply chains is not like flipping a switch. Decades of concentration cannot be undone in a few years. Skilled labor must be retrained. Supplier networks must be recreated. Infrastructure must be rebuilt. Costs inevitably rise. What was once cheap becomes expensive. What was once fast becomes slow. The price of resilience is always higher than the price of efficiency. This is the hidden bill the world is now paying. For China, the shift is equally transformative. Centrality brought growth, influence, and technological advancement. But it also tied enormous portions of the economy to global demand. When other nations seek alternatives, Chinese factories feel the slowdown first. Excess capacity appears. Price wars intensify. Margins shrink. Dominance created scale. Scale created vulnerability. The same feedback loops that once concentrated production can now disperse it. Not all at once, slowly, unevenly, but persistently. Some industries will remain deeply rooted in China for years. The ecosystems are too dense to replace quickly. Others will migrate as costs rise and governments intervene. The future won't be a clean break. It will be a gradual rebalancing. And that rebalancing will be expensive. Consumers will notice higher prices. Companies will face thinner margins. Governments will absorb rising subsidy costs. Global growth may slow as redundancy replaces efficiency. This is the trade-off every system faces once it becomes too optimized. China didn't cause this reckoning alone. The West built the incentives. Corporations chased cost reductions. Markets rewarded consolidation. Voters enjoyed cheap goods. The system evolved exactly as global capitalism encouraged it to. China simply mastered the game better than anyone else. It understood that manufacturing was not just an economic activity. It was strategic positioning. It recognized that whoever sat at the center of production would shape trade flows, technology pathways, and political pressure without ever firing a shot. Supply chains became the modern equivalent of ports, railways, and trade routes in earlier empires. Control the flows, and you shape the world. For a time, China did exactly that. But every monopoly carries the seed of its own erosion. Concentration invites countermeasures. Dependency sparks diversification. Efficiency eventually collides with resilience. The porcelain of the modern age wasn't dishes or silk or spices. It was logistics, components, factories, networks of production so deep and interconnected they became invisible. And just like earlier monopolies in history, once the world fully understood the risk of relying on a single center, it began searching for alternatives, not because China failed, but because dominance itself reshaped incentives. The lesson of supply chains is not that China tricked the world. It's that systems of power rarely look like power when they're being built. They look like convenience, like efficiency, like good business decisions. Only later did they reveal their strategic weight. For decades, global production quietly reorganized around one country. It lowered costs, accelerated growth, and lifted millions out of poverty. It also concentrated leverage in ways few recognized until stress tested. Now the world is entering the next phase. A slower, more redundant, more expensive system designed to trade some efficiency for security. The era of effortless globalization is fading. In its place is a world where supply chains are treated as strategic assets rather than invisible utilities. China's rise as the center of production was one of the most effective uses of economic power in modern history, not through conquest, not through coercion, but through structure, by making itself indispensable, by turning factories into influence, by transforming everyday goods into the foundations of global dependence. Supply chains were never just about moving products. They were about shaping who the world relied on. For a generation, the answer was China. And the world is only now beginning to understand what that truly meant.